alone, no chaperone can get our number. The world's in slumber, let's misbehave. There's something wild about you, child, that's so contagious. Let's be outrageous, let's misbehave.
Historian and author, Miss Molly Haskell. She hails, She hails from Richmond, Virginia, tall and willowy, with family affluence and a liberal arts degree. She could have ensconced herself in Southern society. Instead, she continued her studies at the University of London and the Sorbonne in Paris, immersing herself in the new French wave and the Cahiers du Cinéma, which celebrated the then-forgotten Hollywood Golden Age films. She worked at the French Film Office, translating for the great French directors of the day, and she started a newsletter on French film for the American press. Then she broke into the men's club of film criticism. She added a personal perspective to her film reviews. This was new. She's an original thinker who recognized that when the film studio system ended, the depiction of women in film changed radically. Her study on the subject resulted in her book, From Reverence to Rape, The Treatment of Women in the Movies, cited as one of the most influential film books of all time. She explored the portrayal of women in film and how it correlates with society's perception of women and their perception of themselves. Her writing is insightful and poetic. It's eminently quotable. Her other books include Love and Other Infectious Diseases, a memoir, Holding My Own in No Man's Land, a compilation of essays, My Brother, My Sister, which chronicles her sister's transsexual journey from male birth to becoming female, Frankly, My Dear, Gone with the Wind Revisited, which analyzes why Scarlett O'Hara is an iconic American film heroine, and Steven Spielberg, A Life in Films, which examines his films through the lens of his Jewish heritage. She has written for the New York Times, The Guardian, Esquire, The Nation, Town and Country, The New York Observer, The New York Review of Books, The Village Voice, New York Magazine, and Vogue. Whew. She has served as Associate Professor of Film at Barnard and as Adjunct Professor of Film at Columbia University. Finally, she has written and lectured extensively on Screwball Comedy, noting that its sensuous veneers and nuanced subtexts still resonate with today's audiences because we yearn for a world of genuine lightness and grace. Ms. Haskell will be signing books in the VIP lounge after our discussion, which follows the screening of tonight's film. Please join me in welcoming the patron saint of Screwball Comedy, Miss Molly Haskell.
Thank you, Aliece, for that overly generous introduction. I want to say, first of all, I just think it's fantastic what Aliece and Ed are doing here, to have a Screwball Comedy Festival every year. I mean, I want to move here. It's just incredible. I like Colbert a lot. It's wonderful. I just, hats off. And I think, we were talking about this earlier, Screwball Comedy, especially in today's time, there's a cinema of miserableism here and horror films there. There's something just so not soothing exactly, and not even escapist, but I think the thing about Screwball, I think it endures because it's questioning, it's about marriage. I mean, Stanley Cavell wrote a book calling it The Comedy of Remarriage, because it's about couples that break apart and more or less come together in the end. But it's something we're still doing. We're still doing. First of all, I love the cartoons, and I think they go especially well with Preston Sturges, because there's something really, I mean, he has all these sort of repertory players doing rowdy, physical, boisterous things, And in fact, it's too bad you didn't have Tom and Jerry, because that is the name of the character. He based the names of his characters in the Palm Beach story on Tom and Jerry. And Tom is the Joel McCrea character, and Claudette Colbert is Jerry, and of course the mouse is the one that is the enterprising one and has all the activity. Sturges began as he actually began as a playwright, and then as a writer. He wasn't doing that well as a playwright on Broadway, so he went to Hollywood to make money. Money is always there. I mean, there's the two sides of him, the artist and the money maker. And he wrote very successful films, Easy Living and Remember the Night, but he wanted to direct. He wanted to write and direct. I mean, he was a great dialogue writer, but he also wanted to direct. So he had this idea for a film called The Great McGinty. And he told the bosses that they could pay him $20 for the script if he would let them direct it, and so they did. And it was a big hit, and so after that came the Palm Beach story, and he was off and running with that. I think it's one of the greats. It started, he and Claudette Colbert. Claudette Colbert, who's starring in it with Joel McCrea, had made a movie called It Happened One Night. I'm sure some of you have seen that. It was hugely successful. That's the one. She's a runaway bride. She's a runaway bride here, and she was a runaway bride there. And there's a famous scene where she's hitchhiking, and you see her legs, and that's all anybody could talk about or remember was Claudette Colbert's legs. So she and Sturges were great friends, and she said, "I want you to write a film for me." So he said, "Okay, I will." And so that was sort of the impetus of it. And she was, I think it happened one night. She was something like 32, and this is 6 or 8 years later. So she was older. So she had to play a different character in this, and we'll get into that maybe a little bit more after you've seen the film. But so Sturges, the original type. This was of course during the production code. I mean, the production code. The Hays Office came in with these puritanical codes, backed by most women's groups around the country, to keep sort of dirty things out of Hollywood. So movies were really sort of stripped of anything that, not even just overtly sexual, but sexual at all, and of course anything that challenged the myth of marriage is forever. So Preston Sturges wanted to call his movie "Is Marriage Necessary?" and that didn't go down too well. But I mean, you have to think about that when you're watching the film, because it's, in a way, it's the question he's asking. And Sturges himself has an interesting life, which I think a lot of it comes more in this film. There's more sort of autobiographical material here than in most of his films, but it always comes in bits and pieces. But he was born, his mother was very poor in Chicago, but he had a ne'er-do-well father that left almost as soon as he was born. And she, by hook or by crook, had to bring him up. And at some point, she went to Europe on her own, and somehow she was doing something fairly menial, and she went to the theater. Anyway, she had somebody taking care of her. Preston was like 2.5 years old, and she liked him over to Europe with her. Anyway, somehow she met Mrs. Duncan, who was Isadora Duncan's mother, and was the landlady of a hotel. And she and Isadora Duncan became great buddies. And she suddenly got invited. But I think that's actually, even before that, she had gotten herself invited, because this is important, how enterprising she was on her own. She had gotten herself invited to a fancy party. She was obviously very alluring in some way, and I guess she learned to speak French pretty quickly. Anyway, so she and Isadora Duncan became great pals, and just went around Europe, going to covering, the art scene, absorbing art, loving art in all its forms, and lugging poor little Preston around with her. She then remarried an inventor who is very much what Sturges is and was, and also creates characters after that. He was very successful, so success was important to Sturges. This was important to Sturges. He was successful and apparently fairly tolerant of his wife's activities. So that's sort of the background. And Sturges himself went on to marry, I think, 4 times. One of his wife was an heiress. One of them he met on the train, I think, going to Palm Beach, as you'll see here. So he had this very colorful background, and it sort of came through in a lot of the films. And I think you may have seen Sullivan's Travels, which is this one film that sort of half mockingly confronts. I mean, this is still sort of the end of the Depression. I mean, it's still a vivid, not just a vivid memory, it's still there in a lot of places and among a lot of people. So movies sort of in all movies you sort of sense it somewhere. Some movies confront it directly, and they're sort of protest movies that how America has to change, but others it comes through more elliptically. And I think Sullivan's Travels is much more overt, and I think maybe less successful in a way among Sturges movies, though others might disagree with me. But here, you have the character of Jerry, the wife, and by the way, the beginning is complete chaos. It's so madcap that nobody can figure it out. If you can't figure it out, don't worry, you're not alone. You can't figure it out, and even when you sort of think by the end it's sort of recycling back to that still, it's sort of a mystery, but it's just hell for leather. It just starts hell for leather, and then gradually, well, I think an important point is that, and particularly in Sturges movies, but one of the things about the production code, one of the things that flourished before the code and not after was sort of the femme fatale, the Jean Harlow, Garbo, I mean, there were all these sexy women, and that was really their persona. And that no longer fit with the stories that were going to be told. What had to happen was also sound film had come in, I mean, it came in the 2930s, but it was even more, becoming more and more important. So dialogue was important. So women changed. So women, they couldn't be just lounging in satin and being alluring and maybe a little bit wicked. They now had to be doing something. So they became, so the roles were more active, there was more dialogue for women, and here the woman is really the prime instigator. She's the catalyst for everything. And this is one of the things I think that happened with one of the positive things of the production code. Another was that writers and directors were driven to find more oblique and subtle ways of showing and addressing sex. And Sturges was very good at that. Lubitsch, who preceded him, was the best. And those of you who are going to see Design for a Living tomorrow night, that was 33, and Lubitsch was brilliant at that. But he managed, when the production code came in, he still managed to sort of do his thing in a kind of different way. But, so I think that it's really a comedy about, is marriage necessary? And I don't want to say too much more than that, but I think we can talk about afterward the subtle thing. And it's, I mean, also I think there's it's very funny. Oh, and the other thing is, of course, that Sturges was known for having this repertory group of comic types. It was a thought of from the theater that, a sort of commedia dell'arte, where you had stock characters who played certain things, but he has stock characters, but he infuses them with tremendous vitality and even individuality, and there's sort of people that run through his movies and play different sort of variations of the same characters. Here, you have the Ale and Quail Club. I won't say too much about that, but that's a little more questionable maybe than some of his groups, but it's, you know, that's the sort of the stock characters here, and they have a very loud role to play. So let's see. I think really that's about all I'm going to talk about. I don't want to. I think people to maybe sometimes tell you too much beforehand. So enjoy the film, and we'll talk about it afterwards.
We're all alone, no chaperone, can't get our number. The world's in slumber, let's misbehave. There's something wild about you, child, that's so contagious. Let's be outrageous, let's misbehave. When Adam won Eve's hand, he wouldn't stand for teasing. He didn't care about those